Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Gomera. I'm Director for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services at the UN, and I'm your host for this morning. It's going to be simultaneously fun, engaging, insightful, sometimes worrying. But let's do it anyway. Before we go into it, I'm going to allow Matthew to give a short speech about something that he's planning to do. Then I'm going to say one thing, housekeeping thing. Maybe I should start with the housekeeping. When you leave after lunch, please do leave your badges in a box that will be outside the lunchroom this afternoon. Matthew.
Thanks, Max. Good morning, everybody. Just a quick message, particularly for all of those based in and around Oxford, but for everybody as well. Next month in October, Wild Team are running a project management for wildlife conservation training workshop just outside Oxford at Tubney House, where Wildcrew are based. The training manual on which the workshop is based is available to download for free on our website, so you can look at all the content that we'll be dealing with there, and full details of the workshop are also there. If you've got any questions, do come and talk to me. We're offering a 20% discount for everyone who's attended the Conservation Optimism Summit. It'd be great to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Very generous. We can't extend this. Too often, environmentalists believe that data alone compels belief and action. We believe that the dire state of the world's climate should be sufficient to urge people to reduce emissions. That knowledge of the alarming loss of wildlife should trigger waves of moral outrage and great fortitude. But often people feel overwhelmed by masses of data and do nothing. Now, if there is a lesson from the last 3 days, it should be that to trigger a mass movement for nature, we must translate complex ideas into stories that mean something for people. Thank you, Sean. Where are you? Laurie, Brisetta. That was the theme that I got from some of their presentations. To trigger a mass movement for nature, we must translate complex ideas into stories that mean something to people. I'm inspired, and to some extent, we've been here before. Some 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato once said, "Stories and storytellers rule the world." Now I'm inspired by this idea. The idea that stories enrich society and shape behavior. In his most famous work, The Republic, Plato speaks of the importance of educating the state's guardians, its warrior class. And the first thing he places his ideal curriculum on is storytelling. But not just any stories. Our first line of business, Plato argues, is to supervise the production of stories and choose only those we think suitable and reject the rest. Fast forward back to the present day. Public concern and attention on climate change is at an all-time high. But how can we weather the prospective fluctuations in public concern over climate change and ensure this wave is one that sticks? We are now at a moment where we must respond to the call of this generation's guardians for a future worth having. Today's serious social and ecological crisis demands that we co-create new, globally influential narratives to empower change, as we are seeing increasingly with climate change protests and activism from every continent, emerging from people of all walks of life. Ladies and gentlemen, I can think of no one better than our guest today to help us understand the range and critical moment that we are and that tipping point for public engagement with climate change. Dr. Alice Bell is a co-director at 1010 Climate Action, working on a range of campaigns from community solar to transport and decarbonized heat. As an academic, Alice specialized in public engagement with science and technology, working at the Science Communication Unit at Imperial College, the Department of Journalism at City, and the Science Policy Research Unit at University of Sussex. She has also written for a range of publications, including The Guardian, Times, Research Fortnight, and Al Jazeera. She was a regular correspondent for International Council for Science Climate Policy blog on the run-up to the Paris talks, and launched innovative website, How We Get to the Next, as its first editor. Alice, is your day 24 hours like mine? She is also a trustee of MedAct and sits on the advisory committee for the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, University of Surrey. Ladies and gentlemen, raise your hands as we welcome Alice Bell.
Thank you for that introduction. I don't think I've ever had such a wise and thoughtful introduction. It's so nice to have someone being able to put some of the other talks and conversations that people have been having in context before I speak. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk a bit about this moment. I mean, one thing actually I probably didn't send in my bio, and I guess I haven't been promoting enough, is that I'm also, I now only work 4 days a week at 1010. I am cutting out a bit of those 24 hours in a day, or a day of those a week, so that I can write a book about the history of the climate crisis. And so I am currently, when I'm not working at 1010, buried in the British Library around the I've kind of got as far as the beginning of the 19th century. I'm sort of starting it around I've decided there's lots of different places you could start the start of the climate crisis, and I've decided I'm going to kind of start it in the 18th century. But that's something that I've been doing, and so I've been really thinking a lot about what this moment means in its historical perspective, and I'm going to do a bit of the thing that historians do when they're really annoying, which is be like, this isn't new. Because I think it'll help us think a bit about this moment, to think a bit about the other moments that have happened before. As Max said, we can go back thousands and thousands of years. I'm only going to go back a few decades today, but I think we do need to reflect on that to help us understand how to seize this moment in particular very well, and to think about how we don't want to repeat the mistakes of before, but also what is different about it. Historians do like to say it's not new, but they also, by doing that, allow us to see what is new and to see what is unique and special about this moment. And it is by seeing that, I think, that we will really be able to seize that opportunity. The other thing that I'm going to talk a bit about is this thing that Max mentioned about, it's not just enough to say that biodiversity loss and climate change are terrible. You can, those of us with scientific training know that these things can be very convincing, but that when we go out to the wide world and we go, but facts, the wider world aren't always so receptive to that. We need different ways to bring them in, to engage them with, to help them be involved in these facts, to help us build them, to help us broaden our understanding and to challenge us, but also for them to take ownership in a way. And part of that will be spectacular storytelling, things that are enticing and exciting and charming, like Romeo the Frog. But some of that, I think, also has to be, we have to go beyond just storytelling, because in some ways, storytelling is just another version of this problem of scientists and conservationists and activists who know, telling the public. And go, I have the knowledge, I have the clever, beautifully crafted story that I have done my research to understand that would maximise impact with your audience, and I will just throw it at you. It is still what, when I worked in media studies, we call like the information deficit model, or the idea that I have the knowledge on the stage and I can throw it at you and you can just take it. Even if you wrap this knowledge up as a story and throw it at people, it's still problematic. And I think that if we really want long-lasting, impactful, and disruptive and engaging and exciting action on biodiversity and climate change, then we need to find mechanisms for involving people to help them create the stories and be the storytellers and the story builders as well as the audiences. And that's something that I'll talk a bit about some projects that I think give me hope, give me maybe some optimism at the end about that. But first of all, yeah, is this a tipping point for public engagement with science? I mean, for climate action? I'm losing my... Can you believe? So this woman who arrived in New York last week carrying her sign, having travelled across the ocean, it is only a year since she first took that sign and sat outside the Swedish Parliament. It is only a year. It is less than a year since the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees came out. It is only a matter of months since the report on biodiversity loss came out. And it has been amazing what has happened in the last year. It genuinely is. I think that it is exciting. It is also quite depressing in some ways. I know a lot of environmental activists keep talking about how I should be happy that people are concerned, but I'm really depressed. And it's partly, I think, because intrinsically the stuff we work on is really depressing, but I think there's something about seeing everyone else being depressed that is kind of exciting, because finally they're bloody listening to us. But it's also really depressing because it's sad to see other people depressed, but also we all know it's real, but we can escape it a bit when we go to our friends that don't care about it. And now they're all caring about it too, there's no escape. And it's this thing, and people often talk about this in environmental comms, in that people don't just take action if you shout fire at them. They take action when they see other people responding to the fire. So if the fire alarm went off right now, we'd all be like... And as soon as other people start going out, or taking buckets of water, or whatever we're going to do to tackle a fire, then we'll start seeing the fire as real. And I think this is true for our audiences, that we need to help them engage with the fire. But it's also true for us, in that when we hear in the alarm, and we know that that alarm is real, but it's only when we see other people also seeing and believing it is real, it becomes another stage of devastation for us, I think. It is a real thing. But we have been here before. It is not entirely without precedent. This is from around the Copenhagen talks, almost exactly 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years at the end of this year. And this massive PR campaign, does anybody remember Copenhagen? Whoever came up with that really deserves to win some kind of non-prize. There were huge PR things. I mean, I just noticed actually now this slide has been blown up. I've used this picture a lot over the years, but seeing it so giant, I've only just realised that it's sponsored by Coca-Cola. Should have shown some of the problems we had with this anyway. I mean, there were protests. There were people painted blue, which I never quite understood why. Maybe someone can tell me afterwards why they were painted blue. There were phrases like climate justice, which people are banding around a lot at the moment. It's like, this is my new phrase. I talk about climate justice. You lot are rubbish. You talk about climate change. I talk about climate justice. So like, this is really good. We're talking about justice. But we were talking about justice 10 years ago as well. This is not something that's come out of the ether. We've been talking about, the BBC are paying attention. David Attenborough's done a TV show. David Attenborough did a TV show 10 years ago as well. There was a huge body of work on the BBC. One of the beautiful things about the BBC is that you can kind of time travel a bit on their website and go back. I used to play a game where I'd try and get as far back as possible to like the mid-90s by just clicking links on the BBC website. You can kind of go back to the climate change stuff from about 10 years ago. They had a massive citizen science project. This is the largest climate change experiment ever. They had games, they had all sorts of resources, they had a TV show with David Attenborough, and a whole special panorama episode. There was also, I don't know if anyone remembers, Live Earth, the concert. Oh, massive attacker playing Extinction Rebellion. Madonna was out there with all these international program of concerts around the world screaming, we're going to save the world. And somehow we managed to forget all of this. The other thing that I think is also something that people forget about, and it's important that we don't, is that young people were part of these movements before. So this is actually going back a whole other decade. Because in some ways I think we kind of have this sort of crisis about climate change every decade or so, and you can see this going back to kind of the 30s actually, I think was made, or maybe the 1890s was the first one. But this sort of happened every decade. in increasing levels of intensity. This is the one from 1992 with the Rio talks. And the youth delegation there, and you can still, watch videos on YouTube of youth speakers. This is, I guess this is the equivalent of Greta, but 30 years ago. And there were the same fights around all of this about whether people were doing climate communication wrong, people bitching about celebrities flying. It was more Prince Charles and Prince Harry then, but it's the same argument. There were people that worried that we were being too alarmist in our rhetoric, or not alarmist enough. There were lots of fears over fake news even, although we didn't necessarily call it that then. There was same infighting, spats with skeptics. We said climate chaos more often than climate crisis, but other than that, this wave of worry about climate change only 10 years ago is not that dissimilar to the one that we're having now. Now, there are differences between our current moment and the ones before. So I think in many ways you can see that people have learnt from the mistakes of previous sort of waves. The Paris talks a few years ago, for example, people really thought about the burnout that had happened around Copenhagen. So Copenhagen was devastating to the climate movement for all sorts of reasons. And one of them was just that people were bloody exhausted. All this activity that had been going on, these people that had been inspired by the movement in '92 and have joined it and have been working and working and working, and they were like, finally people are taking me seriously in about like 2006, and they were building up and building up and building up, and then Obama came in and they thought, oh, we're going to do it, and then it was just destroyed. And some of them were suffering from actual PTSD because they were also out in the streets protesting and, got beaten up. But a lot of them were just tired. There was also the ClimateGate hack, which really had a lot of power in some narratives, and you could see people who just thought, this is our moment, and it all was in shatters. And they were exhausted and they were depressed. And I think the climate movement came out of Copenhagen with very little. But at Paris, they had two separate teams. They had, right, you are the Paris team that is going to be working on the run-up to Paris. You're going to be exhausted by the time we close, and so we have another team ready to keep everything going over Christmas. And whatever comes out of Paris, we will be beating a drum of positive momentum change. We will be thinking about and analysing it, and we'll be thinking about our next steps, and we will be shouting about it. So there's a learning there. I think we can see people have learned from other protest movements that have happened in the meantime. Extinction Rebellion in particular has learned a lot from Occupy. There's also been things like the IPCC report. So, this had a huge amount of impact when it came out last October. I remember when people were talking about it, on the run-up to it, and I filled in a survey about how it should do climate comms, and I was like, this is great that they've employed someone who does climate comms, and that they're having surveys about how they should do it, and they've clearly taken, thinking about comms seriously, because the IPCC hasn't necessarily done that in the past too much. But I was pretty sceptical that anyone was really going to care. But they did. And I think this is a classic example of how something where you have got a load of facts that you give to the public, the facts on their own, they were very powerful, but on their own they wouldn't have necessarily reverberated. It was because the context was right for it. It was partly that the people who worked at the IPCC thought about packaging it well, but it was also because other people had done all sorts of other work. People were ready to be scared in the way that they were by the IPCC report. And so this is vital. It was a big, important part of the puzzle. But it could, if it had happened a year before or a year later, I don't know if it would have sparked in the same way. And there's a lot of canny comms that went on around it, but also it was just a matter of chance, I think. There's also things like the youth strike. So I said earlier there were youth delegations to the UN, there were people who travelled to Rio, young people who travelled to Rio and engaged larger publics about that travel. But the youth strikes are something else, and the energy that they have brought to the movement is immense. The knowledge, the enthusiasm, the I am not taking any of this rubbish from you anymore attitude is beautiful. It's something that the climate movement badly needed, and I think it is really refreshing to see. They're clear that the young people who are leading it are very independent-minded people. They're keen to listen to experts and take advice and learn from expertise, and want other people around them to also respect and learn from expertise, but at the same time they are not scared to turn around and say, you are talking absolute bollocks. And it is beautiful to see that. And the way they've inspired each other is so incredible. Go to all these meetings. I've been to all these meetings over the years where people are like, what do we need to have the tipping point for action? And it's the sort of thing that we hadn't ever created. I'd never been in a meeting where we were like, we need the youth to rebel. Because we knew that we wouldn't be able to do that, because it has to come from them themselves. This isn't something that could ever be constructed by some kind of focus group in Greenpeace HQ or something. But it's a sort of dream idea that this would happen, and it has happened, and it's been incredible. And then there's also been the weather. So this is a screenshot of something from a couple of years ago now, 2014, floods. Anyone from all over the world will know this trope, though. You have some kind of problem, and then the politicians go out and stand to be photographed in wellies. And it's a particularly British thing, because even when we have floods that we see as devastating, and they are devastating, in Britain we are quite lucky and our weather is never that bad. So it is okay for our politicians to stand around in some wellies and boots, and they're not actually going to they'll be putting themselves in any particular physical danger. So you can find this online and scroll down and see various politicians who are now, well, particularly that guy, hiding because of our political situation, but this sort of thing about the weather. And the important thing about this is, I think, that the difference between how we talk about weather and climate, there is a difference between how we talk about it now and the way we did 10 years ago. So there would be some kind of weather event, and people would go, well, that's just weather. They're different. And we would go, yes, that's right. I am scientifically literate. I am not going to conflate weather and climate. And some people will be going, yeah, but climate change is part of this. And we're like, no, we can't, because we don't know. It's not, we can't accurately say that this has caused that. And people then get into this big argument about attributing weather events to climate change. And the public were often confused and bored, and were like, okay, I'm just going to get on with actually worrying about it flooding or something. But in the last few years, people have got a lot more confident about saying, well, when these things happen, straight off going, well, we don't know yet because we haven't studied it, but we know that climate change will be increasing the likelihood of this heat wave, this storm, this hurricane. So at the very least, if you don't like this, you want to stop action. You want to take action on climate change because you don't want more of it. And then groups like the Met Office, the World WMO, people like that, are much more confident about saying this particular weather event was X times more likely because of global warming. And I think that has really shifted. I think also just people being more aware of climate change, be more used to it. Generally, the general public see a weather event and go, sometimes problematically maybe, go, climate change. It is much more socially acceptable to see that. And also it is happening more often and people are noticing it. We are having weird weather in all sorts of parts of the world, and we've had it for long enough that people are going, this is not what I like, it's not what I'm used to. And I mean, a lot of that will come from people. People often have weird memories about the weather of their childhood, and it's not necessarily accurate. There's a lot of assumptions that will go into it, but I think this has shifted the public discourse about climate change. And at least to the extent that when there are a flooding event, people go, right, climate change, I should do something about that. There are historical precedents for this. So this is Dr. John Hansen, a NASA scientist, briefing the Senate in the mid-80s. And this is one of the previous waves of climate concern that we've seen. This was one of the 80s moments. I guess you could also attach Thatcher's address to the UN around a couple of years after this guy. And this was a real high point in American concern about climate change. And it happened, it was a very dramatic speech. It made the front page of the New York Times. But it was happening after a heat wave. And there's all these stories about how the air conditioning didn't work in the room he was in and stuff like that. I haven't got to that bit of my book yet, so I haven't studied about whether it's true or not, but it was definitely a heat wave, and that contributed to people's concern. That was part of what made sure, when he sat there and had his facts, which he gave to the Senate, and it was part of that larger context that meant that it flew. It's one of the reasons why the New York Times editor went, right, I'm putting that on the front page. This was resonance. We can also, there were also also concerns about shifts in the weather in the 50s. This is one of the 50s moments. This is Prince Philip, old hippie. So talked to a historian of Silent Spring, the book Silent Spring once, and he said that apparently Prince Philip was really keen and was really influenced by Silent Spring because he loved birds, like shooting them, I guess, but he also liked listening. And that this partly also contributed to Britain passing the Clean Air Act because Prince Philip was so engaged by Silent Spring. But this is from an amazing documentary as part of International Geophysical Year, launching International Geophysical Year that BBC had, called I think it's Our Restless Globe or Our Restless Sphere. And it's on YouTube somewhere and it's amazing. And he sits in this, he stands in the studio at the BBC. And he talks about climate change and global warming and how if there's too much sea ice melt, then Trafalgar Square will be flooded. And he talks to scientists around the globe. His International Geophysical Year was this big, massive international project, really inspiring. You look back at it, pulling scientists from around the world to work together. So there's a lot of Cold War politics around it. And people kind of coming together despite the Cold War divisions, whilst also being spied on because of that, and the way the science quite often gets, the internationalism of science, particularly during the Cold War, can get co-opted for various political desires. But the outside version of it is incredibly beautiful because you have this idea of people all around the globe cooperating together, and one of the real drivers for International Geophysical Year was people like oceanographers saying, we have to work together. My data only means something if I can put it together with data from other scientists from around the world. Oceans do not listen to your weird national boundaries or your odd Cold War. We need to work together. And so he stands in this studio in the BBC, and it cuts to scientists in Japan, and there's a guy in the Arctic dramatically holding an axe. I really recommend finding this, watching it. But again, there were people who were worried. There were research papers about Arctic sea ice melt in the 40s. There were worries in the States about unusual amounts of thaw or just heat waves at particular times of year, and that were in small areas of the country, but were, for whatever reason, good or bad, had made people worry about whether there was something odd going on about the weather. Now, people have wondered about if there's something odd going on about the weather, particularly in America, for centuries. This isn't necessarily due to climate change, but coupled with the emerging data on global warming, which was happening by about then, people were starting to put it together, and you see some of the first news stories about concern over climate change coming out in the 50s attached to some of these things. The other thing in terms of things being different, or what has got us to this moment now, is another generational thing. So this is Captain Planet. For those of you who don't remember him, he is a hero. He's going to take pollution down to zero. It's a very catchy theme tune. And I put him up as a kind of icon for the millennials, or what we might call kind of the post-Rio generation. So a lot of the things I said earlier, the youth movement has been really crucial to this new wave. I think they are so important. The intervention of Generation Z, hope not the final generation, has been so powerful. But I think it's also the fact that people, a couple of generations before them, millennials, are getting quite old now. Millennials are, and I'm a millennial, just. We're quite, particularly if you're just a millennial, we're very old. People are taking up positions of power. So also people who are a bit kind of the younger Generation X, people who watched the Rio talks in 1992 are now the professors. They are now the leaders in the NGOs. But also they're people who have kind of forgotten about climate change because they have other things going on in their life. But it has been a low-level worry for them since as far back as they could remember. They learned about global warming in school, and now they're looking around and they're seeing their own kids going to school and thinking, we haven't shifted this yet. I have been low-level freaking out about this for decades, and now I'm going to go more extreme. And I think that's part of this larger context, which has meant that things like the IPCC report would spike. Because he wasn't alone. In the UK, we have this TV show Blue Peter that's very popular. They had a Blue Peter green badge that was introduced. There was this youth delegation in 1992 to Rio. There are lots of people you talk to now in their early 40s who say, yeah, I got into this stuff because I watched Rio on the news. And they are now in very senior positions, and I think that's part of the shift too. I want to talk to somebody who worked in climate activism for years, particularly a scientist. I won't name him because it's not fair on him. We were at a conference, a bit like this, but much more depressing. It was about, it was a kind of early stage of looking at research into 4 or 5 or 6 degrees warming. And we were at a Cambridge college rather than an Oxford one. And it was kind of alarming also just to watch the scientists who've been working on this, just to watch their emotions. As well as the emotional response that we had to this research, it was seeing what they'd been through from doing it. And we were chatting about how maybe climate science was changing and whether things had shifted from Copenhagen and this is pre-Paris and what was going to happen and stuff. And he was saying, well, the problem is that climate science, people in the 70s and 80s got into it because it had the really big computers and they could just sit in a room and do some really good maths. And the rest of the conservation, but lots of other people who work in environmental sciences were much more aware of the social and political context. They were trained to be part of that. They are much more active about arguing with NGOs and arguing with policymakers and holding their own in these sorts of conversations. Whereas the climate scientists often came from a slightly different set, well, they came from a range of different disciplines, and initially had really got into it just because they really wanted their hands on the really hard maths. And then they found themselves right at the centre of one of the biggest political hot potatoes ever, and they just weren't really prepared. And although a lot of them had learnt over the years how to deal with it, it wasn't what they signed up for. But this new generation of people who are now very senior in climate science, these are the people who got into it because they were inspired by Save the Rainforest or Save the Whale or the Rio talks, or they think they might become Captain Planet when they grow up. And that has been a real, we talk about how science progresses with as each scientist dies, and it can be very slow to progress for that reason, partly because of how hierarchical it can be. But I think this guy seems to think that it was particularly impactful. This generational issue is particularly impactful for climate science and its ability to talk to the public and policymakers, and that had shifting. And I think maybe he was right about that. So, how can we make this moment last? Well, I think we need to give people practical things to do. I think we do need good stories. We need to be aware of this political context that we're throwing our facts into. We need to think about creating charming, exciting, enticing, delighting things to give people to think about, to catch their attention, in ways that aren't just catching their attention and we're all going to die, because that can be powerful, but it can also be really disabling, and we need a diversity of emotional responses to environmental catastrophe. But we also really need to give people opportunities to talk to each other and to be involved in it. So this is sort of simple tree planting. This is one of the most basic kind of techniques you could do for this. Like you get experts who know about trees to decide where the trees are going to be planted and what trees you're going to plant. But actually just planting the trees, although it's probably quicker to get professionals to do it, it's one of those things you can just bring in members of the public and invite them to be involved in. And it can be a very emotional thing, planting a tree. It's a very beautiful thing, thinking about the future and to the long now, the long futures. It's commitment to the future. And it's often a collaborative thing. So one of you digs the hole and then you help them and then you plant it together and you talk. So this is from a tree planting project that we did with flood-affected communities in the Midlands last winter. So these communities that had been affected by floods, and it was helping them plant trees to soak up carbon, but also just as a flood defence. So it's doing mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And we opened up our tree planting days to anyone who wanted to come. And we had people from all over the country come who wanted to show solidarity with people who'd been affected by flooding because they lived somewhere that was safe, which was really useful. And we had so many people meet each other and talk to each other who had never spoken together. In fact, these two women, unfortunately I couldn't find a photograph of them with these two guys, but they were these two very young men. And these two other women, there was also another woman who was a bit older than them, and they all talked to each other. And it was this beautiful bit of intergenerational interaction over just tree planting, as well as people from rural areas and urban areas coming together. It can be really powerful. I think these sorts of things are basic, but we should be doing more of them. Something else that we do at 1010 is a lot of engaging people with the built environment, because although it's vital that we give them opportunities to engage with the natural environment, and a big part of the reason why we're in the situation we are is that people are allowed to divide themselves from the other parts of nature. They don't necessarily think of themselves as human as part of nature, and they're allowed to have this sort of division. But at the same time, we also need to engage with this human environment that we've built, because so many of us have no idea about it. We just live through it and don't really think about it. And we can't change it until we start to understand it. I often say that one of the hardest things in my job is not just that I'm doing public engagement with energy, it's that I'm tackling decades of public disengagement with this incredible system that we've built to be able to have the energy system that we have. And people just, we flip a switch, we pay a bill, and we just hope it's working, and we don't really understand the stuff around it. So this is a group of people we've got with thermal imaging cameras going out into their local area and just seeing the world afresh through the thermal imaging camera. And it's incredible to watch people, how excited they get about a well-insulated pipe. And literally, if it's well-insulated, you can't see anything on the camera, and they're like, look, it's nothing. And you're like, yeah, well done. We tried to make it more fun by hiding hot water bottles, but in the end, actually, people just love walking around like this. They don't really care about the hot water bottles. If any of you want to borrow some heat cameras and run a project like that, you can normally borrow them from your local university, or you can rent them from like hardware stores. Or if you chat to me, I might be able to let you borrow ours. This is from one of the first citizens' assemblies in Camden. So one of the things that Extinction Rebellion have been calling for is citizens' assemblies. This is a scientist, Mark Maslin, from University College London, just down the road from London Borough of Camden, briefing people at the citizens' assembly. And one of the things that I think is really important about this is it allows people to be more connected to policy and a feeling that we are puzzling it all out together. Particularly see the problems that we've had, so many things we've learned about the ways in which Brexit has been managed so badly in the UK, but this sort of division between the political classes and everybody else. And I think we've got an opportunity here for tackling climate change where we bring everyone together to talk about it. Sometimes citizens' assemblies are talked about as like a way of solving the problem. They're not going to solve all of the problems, but I think that they are a really useful tool for us to have, and a way of us engaging people with some of the things that could seem a bit drier and harder to kind of get them involved with a heat camera or planting a tree. This is a project in Brixton called Repowering London. And these are some solar interns. This is, I think, one of my favourite projects in the whole world. So they do solar installations on social housing. They're the first in Europe to do this. But they don't just install solar on the roofs of housing estates and go, right, I've got some renewable energy. They use the money they get from that to train young people who live in the estates to actually install the solar themselves, and then to do energy efficiency work in the estates, helping people tackle fuel poverty. And so these are what they call solar interns who've got a drill because they've been literally installing solar, and they give young people an opportunity to engage with green jobs and do something positive in their community and be really proud of their estates, because their estate now has solar and is much better than all the other posh houses around the other area that don't have solar yet. It's really, really incredible the amount of work that they do, social and community work, that they manage to do off the back of just some solar panels. I was talking to one of the people involved in this project a few years ago, and she was saying one of the things that she hadn't expected was the way in which she knew it was going to help bring the community together, but the way in which it helped the community be more resilient to things like knife crime. Because one of their solar interns, I don't think it's one of the ones in that photograph, was killed with a knife through after being stabbed. And there were lots of different ways in which the community dealt with that, but part of that came from the connections that they had through the solar project. And I think this is a really good example of how projects like this can do all sorts of other work too, and people can see the value of that. Solar Schools is a programme that we've run at 1010 for several years. Had to close it a couple of years ago because the government destroyed the solar industry, but we've still got loads of solar panels on the schools. And similar to that repowering project, we would engage the whole community in the solar. People would feel proud of it. It wasn't just solar being put on the roof and people going, oh yeah, it's a bit more decarbonised. It was about engaging the whole community in it. And it also meant that the kids in the school were proud of those solar panels because they put them there. These kids didn't physically install them because they were too young. But they felt that they put them there because they helped raise the money for it, and they felt they were their solar panels. And they'd have a reader in the school that said, how much solar energy was being produced. And what was so important about that is it didn't just make them go, oh, 10% of our electricity came from solar today. today, it was they were then asked the question about where did the other 90% come from? And they start looking outside of the school too and be engaged in climate action in a way that otherwise they just wouldn't be invited to do. It's something that, you know, rich people do and politicians do. No, this is something that those kids that are just playing were also involved in. It's an example of a wind turbine that's next to a hospital, so it's giving people, and this is a community-owned one, a sense that the local community are contributing to powering the hospital as well as decarbonising the local area, and seeing it as something that they own and is part of that. And this sort of stuff can be done on a big scale too. This is in Copenhagen, where they have offshore wind. Now, offshore wind turbines are like 8 million minimum for one. You know, you have to be really rich to have an offshore wind turbine. So when people do community-owned renewables, it tends to be solar or just a wind turbine, or maybe a small-scale hydro. But in Copenhagen, they like to think a bit bigger than that, community energy. And they were like, why can't we have some community-owned offshore wind? And so they were involved in this array, which is just outside of Copenhagen. And one of the interesting things about this, because the community are involved and they own one of the turbines and they profit from it themselves and use it in their own, well, can do whatever they want with profits really, is that they were involved in design. So you'll see it's curved. Most offshore wind are very regimented. If you ever take a plane into the UK, you can see the wind turbine arrays, kind of very regimented. But they wanted it to be curved because they wanted to be able to see it from the coast, and they wanted to be able to go, my wind turbine. I've not been to Copenhagen, but apparently you can see it. Another example of this going big is that we just plugged in some solar panels to a bit of the network rail grid just last week. We did this. And this is an example of community-owned renewables, not just being like a little installation on a school or even a medium-sized installation on some social housing, but powering 20% of our railways, potentially. And we've developed, working with Imperial College, a system to plug the solar arrays directly into the network rail system. And this is just us doing a small installation as a test rig. The data will go to the University of Birmingham to be able to calibrate. But basically, you take a train from Waterloo in London to Weymouth by the sea next summer. Some of it should be powered by not just solar panels, but community-owned solar panels. And this is a really beautiful example of the power that involving communities with this sort of work can have, because not only will they be able to buy some solar panels, so when they're commuting to work, they'll be like, every day they can think a bit of my ride is powered by sunshine that I own. You know, we can get like travel card holders that have our logo on it, and we can have posters at the station to remind people of this. It gives us a comms opportunity. But it's not just that. They can think about, the communities can be involved in where those solar arrays are going to be sited. We're also working in Wales. The communities can be involved in where, in the Welsh project, it's not just solar, but whether they want wind. Do they want hydro? Have that conversation with people who are against the hydro. What are the different compromises and different types of energy systems do they want, and where would it go? And this idea actually came from a community group. So we're working with the University of Birmingham, we worked with the Energy Futures Lab at Imperial, but the idea came from a small community solar group in the south of England. They were just looking for somewhere to put in their solar farm and weren't sure where they could put it, and were like, can we plug it into the trains? And an electrical engineer who lived nearby went, maybe? And we did the research. It never would have happened if it hadn't been for the enthusiasm and the expertise of those local people. Because they also could be like, well, we could put a solar array here, or here, or here, or here. So, to conclude, I think that it is vital that we seed more projects like this in this moment of opportunity. I think over the last 10 years since our last moment, we have seen projects like repowering, like solar schools, like tree planting projects happen in a small way. But we need to take this opportunity to make it big, because this wave in concern and interest will not continue forever. Even if we are clever and we manage to weather through any scandals like ClimateGate or whatever, even if we manage to engage people in ways that don't put them off as much as I think we have done in the past, it's not going to last forever. It's going to rise and then it's going to fall for a bit. And I hope that if it falls, it won't, sink completely. It'll be still higher than it was before we went on this ride of the last year. But if we really want to keep it, as high as possible, we need to find ways that people have a relationship with the issue. Not just that they think it's spectacular or concerning or interesting or exciting, but they have a way of feeding into systems that they feel some ownership of it. So it's not just that they're like, my train runs on sunshine, but they're like, I own the solar panels that ran it and I helped design them. So that, I guess, is, I'd be interested to hear from people in the conservation movement about things that are slightly less about the kind of more technical infrastructure side of stuff that I do, and how we had some really interesting examples, I think, some of the other plenaries about ways that people could be involved. But that is, I think, our vital challenge, is to think not just about how we can be good storytellers, because that's important. I think we've learned over the years how to be better storytellers. How can we be able to learn how to be better at involving people and listening to them and letting them build the new stories?
Thank you, Alice. I promised you it would be thought-provoking. Questions? We'll take a few questions. Yeah, let's start here.
Do you think the rise in young people and the rise in their organization, that a lot of that has to do with the internet and social media and how that can be used in positive ways, not necessarily all the misinformation and the negative stuff, but that we can even harness like that energy where they're paying attention there? You think that has something to do with why it's different now?
Yeah, I mean, the young, I think one of the reasons that they have grown in the way they have is that they have utilised that. And it's one of the things that's really beautiful about the youth strike movement is how international they are and the way that they have built friendships. So when Greta arrived, she was greeted by other sort of her equivalents in parts of the US who were like, this is my friend. And they talk about their friends, people who they've never met, they support each other. I think they're also very aware that the ones in Europe and America are very aware that for all that it's difficult for them, they're in an incredibly privileged position to some of the other climate strikers, and this beautiful sort of international solidarity that has grown through them all. But I mean, that's not new. We saw that was happening at the Copenhagen stuff too. You know, the internet has been around for a while. I think it's definitely been an enabler, and I think we've seen people using it cannily in a way that they maybe weren't so canny about it in 2009. It also is a problem though as well. You know, people were worried about this thing we call fake news in 2009, and I think we're more worried about it now. So the internet is just another thing that's here, and it was part of the discourse around Kyoto, even in 1997, although in a small-scale way. One of the things you can see in the history of the UN climate talks have been really powerful for bringing activists together. And so in the early days, in the 90s, you look at that was this real opportunity where people who'd never really met each other would come together and share ideas. You know, they'd have zines as ways of communicating about different techniques for action. You've got things like the idea of having a tripod, which are just 3 sticks together, to block roads. It was used by the Reclaim Streets movement in the 90s. That was spread originally it came from anti-deforestation protests in Australia, and the technical equipment idea sort of spread with people just sharing ideas at anti-globalization meetings in the 90s. And similar things happened with the climate talks. But as these have gone on through the noughties and now through whatever we call this decade, you see people coming together to meet people they're already talking to on the internet. So one of the things that's going to be a real opportunity with the COP in Glasgow is thinking about how lots of people from Europe will travel to Glasgow and meet in person for the first time. Certainly when I went to Paris, it was really, for the Paris talks, it was really, I was part of a group that were using that as an opportunity to build an international movement in a particular area that I campaign on. And it's just that's one of the ways in which we've seen the internet be different. It's facilitating those conversations earlier.
Right, so Matthew?
Thank you for that amazing talk. I think that pause at the end is because we were all just so engaged and captivated by what you were saying. It was incredible, so thank you so much. In October, Extinction Rebellion are holding their next round of actions in London. And I wondered what you thought the potential impact could be of every conservationist, every academic, every environmental scientist in the country joining in that action, sharing their voices and adding their bodies to that cause, what you think the consequence could be.
I would say that before then there's a global youth strike in the 20th of September, and I'd say that's one that would probably, so I think there's lots of power in conservationists particularly. There's a different power, although a different maybe danger for scientists being involved. Scientists often get really worried about doing political activism, like it might destroy their scientific credibility. I think we need to lose that. We need to accept that science is part of the political system. Something I researched as a historian before I got into doing history of the climate crisis. I did a lot of work on radical science movements of the 1970s in the US and the UK. And the ways in which they came to what they saw as a crisis of science in society, where people were not listening to scientists and they were also worried about all sorts of other problems like nuclear war. And they said, well, this is because scientists do not engage with the general public and are not open about their politics, and so we just need to be open about this, and we need to take it to the streets and the people. And I think that we could do the same for, around the issues that we have now. So if people want to join the Extinction Rebellion protests, that's probably a good thing. It totally should depend on their own circumstances. There's a lot of problems with Extinction Rebellion, not least this idea that you should be arrested. That is a privilege that not everybody has, particularly the racial politics in the UK, but so many other countries around that. So the youth strikes, though, is much simpler. So you can lobby the UC, if you're in the UK and you're a scientist, you might well be a member of the UCU union. The UCU union is calling on all unions to respect that strike, so you could be part of that. You might be a member of Prospect, there's people working through that. There are lots of other ways that you can support the strikes, and I think that's possibly a more powerful place to take action. And also, if you are thinking, maybe I'll be involved in the Extinction Rebellion ones, it's a way of trying that ground a bit. So yeah, I don't think people should worry about the dangers of it too much, apart from their own personal circumstances. It could be really impactful, but there's an opportunity before then. So yeah, I'd look to the youth strikers.
So is it not a matter of choosing your audience very well? Sean was telling us that if the audience is people who want to hear the scientific facts, then there's room for scientists to participate in that process, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, one of the things that's been really inspiring around the youth strikes and the Extinction Rebellion stuff is seeing some scientists go and be like, the way that they're going as a scientist, as an expert, is they sit there and they go, I'm a scientist and you are clearly interested about climate change or biodiversity loss, ask me some questions. And so they're not going necessarily as a protester, but they're engaging in that. And remember with when Occupy happened, loads of economists were like, oh, the public are talking about the economy. And so I got called into this meeting of economists to talk about the public engagement with the economy. And I was like, well, there's all these people on the streets who are camping out because they are interested in the economy. Why don't you go and talk to them? And they're like, no. Chat to them, and you can do it like that. But there will be different places that you could go. There's also a danger in thinking that that's the only place you can go, because that's the one that's exciting. Because there are so many other places that you can go and talk about your work. To people who would not be engaged in Extinction Rebellion or the youth strikes, and they're such a crucial, important audience. Because if they're already at a protest, they've already been engaged.
There's a gentleman at the back there, please.
Thanks very much. I think the difference between Copenhagen and now is that those of us who were engaged in the climate action at that point and very much engaged at the community level as well, we assumed that governments were going to act. And so when Obama came and didn't act, or indeed continued with the same system, however much nicer he was than current incumbent, the same system was continuing. And I think now the shift is really that we don't see governments as being able to act. They're incapable of it. They're caught within a system which has its own logic, which has its own developmental logic around extraction of resources and destruction of the environment as a consequence of that. And I think that's a huge difference. When I talk to kids who are in the school strike stuff, they have really very little hope for the future. But what you said earlier, which I thought was really powerful, was that hearing other people's despair around the situation we're in is incredibly empowering. Not feeling alone in that, but hearing that other people are also recognizing the severity of the situation and not pretending that conference rooms like this are going to continue for very long. Not pretending that this system is inevitable and we've got a climate change problem out there, but actually there's something fundamental in how we're living and in the system that we're engaged in that we need to tackle. And I guess the bit that I was slightly missing in your talk, maybe that's because it wasn't focused on that, was just the systemic issues. That there is this movement, and of course movements rise and fall and so on, but there's a systemic problem which is about a particular system that we're up against and which we've been taught is inevitable. And I just wanted to remind us of that lovely titled book, The Soviet Union was Forever Until It Was No More. So that was a lovely title. People in the Soviet Union thinking that system was going to go on forever until suddenly it went. And we're in very much that kind of frame at the moment, I think. Just around Citizens Assembly, I wanted to ask you, because as I understand it within XR, Citizens Assembly, the idea of that is it not a kind of policy recommendation or a consultation with people, but saying we need to hand the power from political parties which are incapable of taking action to representative sample of citizens who have to be trusted to take the right action. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about citizens' assemblies, they're now being used in all sorts of other ways. They're kind of a victim of their success. There's a national one that I think they're going to announce who got the tender for that soon. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And they're being used, I think they're working in slightly different ways in different local authorities, depending on who's running them and how much they've been able to think. Like the Camden one was done very quickly, the one that I had the photograph of. Yeah, there is a slight, behind some of the enthusiasm for citizens' assemblies is a much more radical critique of the political system. And I think you're totally right that that's a big shift. But at the same time, there's still a lot of people involved, not just in the global climate movement as a whole, but Extinction Rebellion specifically, who still see this power as coming with the politicians. So I was doing a talk a couple of months ago, and there was someone from XR, and there was the inevitable question of, what can I do? And so the various different people on the panel, there was a guy from the drinks industry who said you should recycle, and there was a scientist who said you should, there were people had their things. I was like, invest in solar. And the Extinction Rebellion guy was like, just lobby your politicians, because that's all you can do. You've got to vote and you can lobby your politicians and then there'll be the change. And it was like, that is so, it's not true. Power lies in so many different places. And yes, I do think you still should be lobbying your politicians, and I think one of the powerful things that Extinction Rebellion has done is raise awareness in politicians that the public care about climate change. However, if we look at power as just being there, we won't get anywhere, because that was one of the problems we had with Copenhagen, and we've learned that. So I guess one of the things that citizens' assemblies do give me hope is there a chance to reform some of those things. Although that will take, I guess, will it take time? Maybe you're right in that it was forever and now it's no more. We live in politically interesting times, so maybe there's an opportunity there.
Indeed, in so many ways than one. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, so help me thank Dr. Bell.